Boomers and Gen Z seem to be living in different timelines. One built the suburbs, the other can't afford rent. One swore by the evening news, the other swears by TikTok. One has pensions, the other has matcha. But how different are they really? On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're comparing Gen Z and the baby boomers. Baby boomers grew up in a time that feels almost unreal now, when houses were cheap, jobs were secure, and the future looked endless. The U.S. economy was booming in the post-World War II era. Many people could rely on not only lifelong careers but lifelong employment in the same place, with good pension funds waiting for them when they retired. It felt like things would stay good forever. They didn't. Gen Z might be the first generation, or second after millennials, in recent history to be worse off than the one before it. They grew up watching the world baby boomers always had faith in shrink and leave very few places at the table for Gen Z. Owning a home feels like a stretch. Owning a home before 35 feels like a dream. And that's backed up by stats, as you'll soon see. Job security does not exist. Not only can companies lay you off at any time, and not just due to your work performance, but due to bad decisions at the top, downsizing, automation, or simply wanting to lay you off before they have to promote you and pay you much more. Jumping from company to company is one of the only ways to get better pay. A March 2023 study found that Americans who had switched jobs in the past year reported a 7.7% increase in pay. Compare that to Americans who hadn't switched and reported just a 5.5% increase. Maybe that's why Gen Z is switching jobs 134% more frequently in 2023 than they were in just 2019. Other surveys find that Gen Z will switch careers an average of 3 times in their lifetime because they're not getting paid enough, because their jobs are being slowly or sometimes instantly automated away, or because they just can't stand the suffocating grind of longer hours and shrinking benefits anymore. On the other hand, 41% of baby boomers had spent 2 decades with the same company. 18% had spent more than 30 years at the same desk. For Gen Z, that desk probably got replaced by a robot. These 2 generations aren't just years apart. They are different civilizations trying to share the same country. Boomers inherited stability after World War II, rising wages, strong unions, affordable education. Ironically, much of that stability was later dismantled by their own generation, the political and corporate leaders who came after. Unions have been systematically gutted. In 2022, just over 10% of U.S. workers were unionized, down from a peak of 33.5% in 1954. And it's not just an American story. In the UK, union membership peaked in the late 70s at 58% of workers. Today, it's just 22%. The minimum wage in the U.S. also hasn't changed at the federal level since 2009, staying stuck at $7.25 since then. Maybe that's why Gen Z is more pro-union than the baby boomers ever were. 64.3% of Gen Z supports unions as of 2020, while only 57.2% of baby boomers do. But when the boomers were younger, their support was even lower. Just under half of them supported unions in 1976. We can't be sure why support was so much lower, but it may be because strong wages and unionization were a given back then. The world baby boomers inhabited rewarded patience and conformity. Work at a company long enough and you'll be able to comfortably retire. Loyalty was rewarded with promotions and salary increases. Even beginning work at a company was more rewarding back then than it is now. A consumer affairs study looked at economic changes in the U.S. and found that Gen Z has 86% less purchasing power than baby boomers did at the same age. Getting access to better job opportunities has also gotten exponentially harder. Gen Z is facing much higher public and private school costs than baby boomers did, 310% higher for public schools and 245% higher for private schools, respectively. No more part-time cashier gigs to pay for college. That era is gone. Because while costs have exploded, real compensation, adjusted for inflation, has barely budged. From 1979 to 2019, the typical worker's pay rose only 15.8%. In other words, between the time the boomers were settling into careers and the moment Gen Z started entering the workforce, wages barely moved at all. And that's not because they're lazy either. As your most whiskey-loving uncle likes to say every Thanksgiving, net productivity actually grew during the same time period, but the strength of unions faded. So most financial gains went straight to the top, the CEOs. No wonder Gen Z grew up in a world of anxiety. and no surprise so many of them still live with it. The climate crisis has shifted from a distant threat to a daily reality. Housing shortages have made homeownership nearly impossible. Since 1973, home prices have soared 1,045%. Gen Z is criticized for spending their money on skin creams and brunches rather than saving up to invest in a house. The truth is, while Gen Z does earn slightly higher wages in real terms, the big-ticket milestones that defined the earlier generations, a college degree, a home of one's own, are more expensive than ever. It doesn't help that Gen Z works a lot to get that money, and it doesn't feel that secure in the jobs they're doing. Instead of stable, lifelong work, Gen Z entered the gig economy. Even many of those lucky enough to get an entry-level full-time job work part-time to make ends meet. Whether that's working as Uber drivers, delivering Postmates, or selling trash-core raccoon accessories on Etsy. Look it up, it's a thing. And we're not here to judge. About 24% of Gen Z drives or have driven for an app to add to their income. In addition, 51% said they're expected to monetize one of their hobbies in the coming year to add to their income as well. Boomers truly believed hard work would pay off because for many of them it did. Adulthood was a series of predictable milestones. Marriage, homeownership, children, all achieved before the age of 30, for most, as the stats show. According to the National Association of Realtors, the median age for first-time homebuyers in 2024 was 38. That is the highest it's ever been. In 1980, the median age was 29 years old. Adulthood for Gen Z is a continuous struggle for financial survival. A 2023 global workforce survey found that only 24% of baby boomers feel insecure in their jobs, while that share rose to 50% for Gen Z. Maybe that's why at 30 years old, most of Gen Z that works outside of tech and finance lives with 2 roommates or in mom's basement and tends bar on weekends for extra cash. A 2023 Bloomberg survey found that 45% of those aged 18 to 29 lived at home, an 80-year high. 60% of Gen Z and millennials reported moving back home between 2021 and 2023, either because they couldn't afford to live on their own or they needed to save money. Never mind saving up for a retirement fund and investing for the future, most of Gen Z is hustling just to afford next month's rent. Surprisingly, this makes Gen Z much more willing to work harder than baby boomers, going right against the stereotypes for both generations. According to one analysis, 58% of Gen Z said they would work nights and weekends to get better pay. Less than half of baby boomers said the same thing. And those aren't just empty promises. The same global workforce survey found that younger people, including Gen Z and younger millennials, gave away 8 hours and 30 minutes of free work per week by coming in early, staying late, and working during lunchtime. Baby boomers, they only gave away 5 hours and 14 minutes on average. In an ideal world, people would be getting paid for all the work they're doing, of course, but still. Because the younger generations grew up in an age where there's not much point in company loyalty, people can be fired at any minute due to fewer protections, mass layoffs are a fact of life, so they're more likely to want to take the reins of their own work life. Gen Z has the highest entrepreneurial aspirations of any generation. A surprising 42% of them want to have their own business, outpacing every other generation by at least 10 percentage points. The lack of company loyalty also makes sense when you learn that not only are companies paying their workers less for their cost of living, they're also refusing to give them basic health insurance. Even up to 1989, squarely in Gen X territory, 61% of young college graduates could count on employer-sponsored health insurance. That fell to 31% by 2012. For high school graduates, the news is even grimmer. Only 7% of them could count on employer-sponsored health insurance in 2012, compared to 24% in 1989. The shift has affected Gen Z in many areas of their life. Not only is their financial reality different from that of the boomers, but their social reality is pretty different as well as their definition of what success, family, and happiness is. We'll start with one of the biggest and most observed differences among baby boomers and Gen Z's social reality, at least in the US, the increasing diversity of each generation. A bare majority, 52% of Gen Z, is non-Hispanic white as of 2019, while in 1969, 82% of baby boomers were non-Hispanic white. Maybe that explains why a majority of Gen Z says that increasing racial and ethnic diversity is good for the US, while only 48% of boomers agreed with that statement. When it comes to relationship realities, boomers were very focused on the nuclear family. Gen Z is lonelier than ever. A GWI survey found that almost 80% of Gen Z had experienced feelings of loneliness in the past year. Only 45% of baby boomers reported the same feelings. But even when Gen Z isn't lonely, they accept different kinds of families, including chosen families, meaning a close group of friends that function like a family support unit for those who haven't married or settled down yet, or possibly ever. 87% of baby boomers have been married at least once before the age of 46, but contrary to popular beliefs, it is not that Gen Z looks down on marriage. One 2023 report found that 81% of Gen Z was open to getting married. Around half of them saw it as a definite event in their future. And while most Gen Zers were either excited or anticipating their future weddings, only 8% of them thought of marriage as outdated. So it seems like Gen Z does want partnership and marriage, they're just putting it off until later. On the other hand, for a generation so gung-ho about traditional values in marriage, baby boomers also had the highest divorce rates of all time. A 2021 U.S. Census report found almost 35% of all Americans that got divorced in the past year were over 55. Baby boomers. That is twice the rate of any other age group included in the survey. Okay, well, maybe it's just because their kids were finally out of the house and they got around to doing something they wanted to do a long time ago. Not really. In fact, one study found that since the 1970s, boomers have been responsible for most of the rise in divorces, more than any other age group. A University of Minnesota paper studying the phenomenon and adjusting for age found that the baby boom generation was responsible for the extraordinary rise in marital instability after 1970. They are now middle-aged, but their pattern of high marital instability continues. Maybe that's why Gen Z is waiting to get married. They have seen what happened to a generation, the baby boomers, who tied the knot at just 25 for men and 23 for women, and they would rather take their time. Gen Z is also just seeing more upside to being single. One Tinder survey found that 81% of young adults saw benefits to being single in their career, their friendships, fitness, and hobbies. As one researcher put it, Gen Z is rejecting the idea that a traditional relationship is the default path to happiness. Technology has only deepened the divide between the two generations. Boomers see the internet as a tool, something to use, and sometimes not that adeptly, which is why you still get calls from your dad about how to change his iPhone wallpaper. But while Gen Z might be experts on handheld devices, they never had the luxury of using the internet as a simple tool. They lived online from a distressingly young age. They were shaped by algorithms before they could even vote. Baby boomers only spend an average of 3 hours and 31 minutes a day on their phones. Gen Z clocks an average of 6 hours and 27 minutes. A 2018 U.S. study of children and teens found some troubling results from this increased screen time. Up until 1 hour of use a day, screen time didn't seem to have much of an effect. But after that, more hours were correlated with lower psychological well-being, including less curiosity, lower self-control, more distractibility, more difficulty in making friends, less emotional stability, being more difficult to care for, and inability to finish tasks. High schoolers who were high users of screens were more than twice as likely as low users to have been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, and/or treated by a mental health professional in the past year. That's a whole lot of problems. That being said, the youngins know it's an issue. 66% of them say they want to cut back on their screen time, to the point where many feel more comfortable with digital rather than real-life communication. One customer service company found that 20% of Gen Z prefers to start their customer support with a chatbot. Their aversion to human interaction runs so deep that 38% of Gen Z and millennial customers say they'll give up on fixing an issue entirely if they can't resolve it through self-service tools. Literally anything to avoid using the phone for the purpose it was originally designed for. Boomers, on the other hand, grew up with call centers and would rather still call someone to resolve an issue. Only 32% of high school seniors saw their friends every day in 2022. The average member of Gen Z reports having 2 close friends. For boomers, that number was closer to 5. Many Gen Zers also got their ideas about relationships and sex from random influencers before they had even held hands with a middle school crush. A lot of them saw porn before experiencing their first kiss. Actually, a majority of them did. A UK survey of 5,300 18 to 29-year-olds found that 45% of them said porn was one of their main sources of information about sex. Which is great considering we all know how realistic porn is. And a full 70% of Gen Z men said their first exposure to sex came through porn. 63% of them had seen it before they turned 16. Baby boomers figured out a lot of the world, including their friendships and relationships, by trial and error and experiencing them. Gen Z heard and saw way too much information about all of that before they even got around to trying it for themselves. That being said, boomers were by no means naive. In fact, Gen Z might be a little more prudish. Boomers had the highest average number of sexual partners of any current generation, an average of 11 per person. Gen X averaged around 10, while millennials averaged about 8. Weirdly, boomers were also the least likely to approve of premarital sex, even though they were obviously having a lot of it. And this may be one data point in which Gen Z is actually becoming more close-minded. While boomers have continued to progress on many social issues over the years, Gen Z might not be as open about sexual issues as we think. 84% of those over 65 said they didn't care about a person's past when it came to body count. But Gen Z, only 48% of them said their partner's body count wouldn't bother them. And that made them the least likely of any generation to say they weren't bothered. Maybe that's because Gen Z is becoming more reserved about sex in general. One Kinsey survey in 2022 found that 1 in 4 Gen Z adults had never had sex with a partner. A Business Insider survey found that that number was as high as 37% of Gen Z. And for a generation raised with porn and now OnlyFans, it's surprising how little they actually want to see even the suggestion of sex anywhere. One survey found that 48.4% of Gen Z thought there was too much sex and sexual content in TV and movies. Another 59.7% wanted more content where the central relationships are friendships, with 54.1% asking for portrayals of characters who aren't interested in romantic relationships at that point in time. Part of that trend could be because of the decentering of romantic relationships in general, and the increased emphasis on other social relationships. Gen Z respondents also said they wanted healthier friendships with healthy conflict resolution portrayed, which does sound wonderfully balanced and healthy, but also probably the most boring movie ever. In that sense, it seems as baby boomers have gotten more progressive in their attitudes toward people's sexual histories, Gen Z has gotten slightly more judgmental. But then again, Gen Z spends their entire life under a microscope. Gen Z's sense of identity, humor, and politics was formed under intense digital surveillance. Some people have often criticized today's generation of teens and 20-year-olds for not going out. The death of bars and clubs is being blamed on them, though the factors that keep Gen Z in the house are many: depression, anxiety, less willingness to engage with alcohol, smaller or non-existent social circles. One that gets overlooked is how worried Gen Z is about their carefree moments being recorded. Baby boomers and most generations before Gen Z, honestly, were young and stupid before everyone had a high-resolution digital recording device in their pocket. Gen Z has never known that world. Any dumb thing they do, any tipsy moment, any awkward dance move can go viral on TikTok the next day and make them the laughingstock of their school or even their country, depending on how far the video reaches. The fear isn't just confined to nightlife either. One study found that 19% of Gen Zers have quit the gym because they don't want to be recorded. And they're not paranoid. 10% of gym goers admit to secretly recording other people while working out. If they're okay with admitting that, imagine how many more people have done it and just didn't want to admit that they were creepy to a surveyor. Boomers value privacy. With the small exception of boomer men who post a different unflattering selfie on Facebook every day for unknown reasons, most of them keep their private life offline. Gen Z values visibility, not just because of a rise in narcissism, like many critics imply, but also because being seen is the only way to exist in a system that forgets you the second you log off. This is apparent in stats that show 88% of Gen Z have no problem sharing personal information with social media apps to get personalized experiences. That is an over 20% difference with the generations above them, including the boomers. Weirdly, though Gen Z may be the digital native generation, they're also more likely to fall victim to scams, perhaps because of their lack of privacy concerns. A Deloitte survey found 16% of Gen Z and 5% of boomers have been caught up in an online scam. That is 3 times more Gen Zers being scammed online than boomers, and some boomers still open emails from Nigerian princes. The clash between the generations isn't about who is right or who is better, it's about perspective. More boomers still believe the system can be repaired, because by and large they grew up in a system that largely worked for them. Gen Z doesn't think the system was ever built to work for them, since so many of them have been left behind, and to a large extent, they've been proven right. One generation trusts experience, the other trusts data. The truth is, both can be useful. That being said, Gen Z and baby boomers are closer on some issues than we might imagine. 44% of Gen Z and 57% of baby boomers think that politicians from all parties are less honest today than they used to be. And the system that has left Gen Z out in the cold is starting to turn its back on the baby boomers as well. Though boomers believed in a good pension and comfortable retirement, data shows that half of them are working past the age of 70, which is definitely not the life they had in mind. Also, all those warnings boomers gave young people about spending too much time on screens and devices, it seems Gen Z, half of whom admitted to Pew Research Center that they are almost constantly on their devices and feel addicted to them, agree they have a problem. However, each generation seems to have different solutions to the problem they observe. 70% of Gen Z thinks the government should do more to solve problems. Meanwhile, only 29% believe the government was doing too much, and some things should be better left to businesses and individuals. Among boomers, the split on pro and anti-bigger government was 49 and 49%, almost right down the middle. These grievances may explain their differences in attitudes toward the U.S. as well. 65% of boomers believe the U.S. is the greatest country in the world, but 65% of Gen Z says the U.S. is no greater than other countries. These attitudes aren't that surprising when you take into account that boomers and Gen Z have experienced almost two completely different versions of the U.S. You've seen Gen Z and the boomers go head-to-head, but where do all the other generations fit in? Watch Every Generation Explained in 10 minutes to see how they've each shaped the world, or click on this video instead.